detail, I do encourage you all to pick up a copy of it, because most of the detailed numbers are available here in the report. So our study really has sort of two main parts to it. It examines how Europe can show climate leadership, both by undertaking domestic actions to rapidly reduce emissions, and also by fulfilling its international obligations to help developing countries address the crises of development and climate change. We start very much from the point of view of what the science says needs to be done, and this chart here shows you a couple of sort of key trends. So one thing you can see at the top line, the orange line, is a 2 C emergency pathway. It's the kind of pathway in greenhouse gas emissions that's going to be required to keep climate change within safe limits, within 2 C. So that's kind of like the bottom line that the globe as a whole has to stay within. If we think about Annex 1 countries and think about very aggressive reductions in Annex 1 countries, and then subtract that from the 2 degrees pathway, you can see that by subtraction what's left is the pathway for non-Annex 1 countries. So you can see that even with extremely aggressive reductions in Annex 1 countries, there really is not a whole lot of space left for developing countries to continue to develop and to meet their development aspirations within the overall climate budget that science says is left to us. So that's the starting point for this report. We've started by thinking about what is that budget available to Annex 1 countries. So in terms of international obligations, we also look at Europe's overall international obligations for assisting the developing world to make a transition to a low greenhouse gas future. So the overall approach that we've used it comes from the Greenhouse Development Rights Framework, which is a basis for thinking about fair contributions to the overall climate burden sharing effort. That report is also available from SEI. You can see the cover of it there, or you can download it from gdrights.org. So using the GD Rights Framework, we've estimated what we think is Europe's fair share of the climate burden, and it actually comes to a number that is maybe a little counterintuitive. It comes to reductions of 103% below its 1990 emissions. So, how can it be bigger than 100%? Well, it can only be understood if you think of it being in terms of 2 obligations. One is to do domestic actions, but the other is to assist the developing countries with their own mitigation efforts. That translates, in terms of the international efforts, that translates into a very large number, between 150 billion and 450 billion, which is maybe between 1 and 3% of the EU's projected 2020 GDP. Now, in turning to domestic actions, the way we've addressed this is to look at a very detailed mitigation scenario of the kind of actions that can be undertaken by Europe, within Europe, so not including offsetting, the kind of actions that can be done within Europe to address climate change. We've prepared a very detailed scenario for all 27 EU countries that aims at 2 targets: a 40% reduction relative to 1990 values by 2020, and close to 90% by 2050. And what we find is that in fact can be achieved. It will require a massive effort, but it can indeed technically be achieved through a combination of very radical efficiency improvements, the accelerated retirement of fossil fuels, and a dramatic shift towards various types of renewables, including wind, solar, wave, geothermal, and biomass-based CHP. In this particular scenario, at the request of Friends of the Earth, we've excluded certain options, including nuclear power, carbon capture and storage, and biofuels. And we haven't looked at offsetting, so we're really focusing on achieving those targets domestically within Europe. We've also looked at the issues of sufficiency, equity, and lifestyles. So this scenario is very much a scenario of Europe continuing to grow and get richer in the future. But we have looked at a number of issues, such as having a more equal Europe in the future. So there's faster growth in poorer countries, less growth in richer countries. We've also looked at the issue of lifestyle changes. So we've looked at healthier diets, more leisure time, increased share of public transport. Just a couple of charts from the scenario. I haven't got time to show you in very much detail at all, but some of the key aspects are, you can see some of it here, very radical improvements in efficiency, which does seem to be possible, and also switching to lower carbon fuels. So we're phasing out coal very rapidly. We're also phasing out oil and gas where possible, switching to CHP and renewables, but very dramatic improvements in energy efficiency. Skip that one. On the supply side, a very radical switch to electric generation to various types of renewables, very rapid phasing out of coal. So these things do seem to be possible. There's sufficient wind power available, there's sufficient wind potential and sufficient renewable potential to provide these kinds of energy requirements. It also seems to be possible to build the kind of renewables that you need quickly enough. It's going to require a big mobilization, but it does seem to be possible. And then finally, just in terms of the cost of mitigation, we've done a kind of preliminary estimate of the costs, including the major sectors involved, and we find that the costs come to about somewhere between 2 and 3% of GDP, which is broadly consistent with what other studies looking into sort of major transitions are talking about. So remember, to that though must be added Europe's international obligations for helping developing countries do their own transition, and that also comes to a further 1 to 3% of GDP. So the costs are not small, but they're not inconceivably large either. They're somewhere between, we think, 3 to 6% of GDP. But what you've got to balance that against is the cost of inaction. We haven't looked at that specifically in this report, but the most authoritative sources in that regard is probably the Stern Review, which comes up with estimates saying the costs of not acting on climate change are likely to be at least 5% and perhaps as high as 20% of GDP. So yes, this is going to require a major mobilization, but the cost of doing something looks like it's dramatically lower than the cost of not